position where the coronal plane is parallel to the table. And if it's parallel to the table, we really don't need a pillow, because we don't want to get the craniovertebral ligaments tightened, because otherwise you cannot distract the occiput. So we want to keep the craniovertebral ligaments in neutral, and sometimes if the suboccipital region is very tightened between occiput and C2, sometimes we even have to put them in a little bit of posterior rotation to take the tension away while you're doing the distraction. And then you bring them back to neutral. Then what I want you to do is to take the head into full head and neck flexion. You're taking an observation of the chin to the sternum and towards the shoulders. And you feel the tension of the nuchal ligament. You cannot support him on your manipulative tummy. His axis of rotation is here. And then you say, now, okay, now rotate towards the left. And that's the maximum rotation he has to the left. Come back to neutral. Now go towards the right. And that's the amount of rotation he has to the right. Coming probably to half of the clavicle. And that's the rotation he has to the left. And I pick him up because when you were doing the technique of distracting the occiput, I said, rotate the head to the left and stand behind the head. I saw that he only had limited range of motion to the left relative to the right. That's why we're using him as an example. Now bring your mandible forward. Okay. Very interesting. I don't even know what the transfer process is. Are you sure you have one? Bring your mandible forward. Okay. It's hard. Fine. That's pretty painful right there. So the transfer process of atlas on the right side is more prominent than the left side. So I'm presuming because I still have not done the technique, that atlas is rotated to the left, giving him a left rotation restriction. That's my diagnosis. And you write it down, underline it with red, and put some flashing lights on the side. So, has anybody seen my blue head? There's my blue head. Okay. So now you have to realize that you're going to put your hands around the head, and you're going to start doing some very gentle long axis distractions. Just with the head on top of the bed. Then you're going to put your hands under the occiput, on front, but this is going to be your axis of movement. So you're going to start doing just a pure rotation. The same amount of tension you put in the lower hand, you put in the upper hand, so that the axis remains right at the center. It's not that, and it's not this. It's just a pure rotation. So we do a gentle kind of courtesy distraction. Put my hand on occiput, neutral, and we do maybe 15 degrees of cranial rotation. Hold for 6 seconds. Very short, very little. This guy has been in a state of immobilization for at least 10 to 12 years. Have you been in automobile accidents?
No.
Sports? Any trauma in sports?
Yeah.
What do you do?
Skiing.
You ski, okay. Okay. You had enough traumas to your head and the neck, just by learning probably. Are you a heavy skier? Where do you live?
California.
Where do you go?
Tahoe.
Right in Tahoe in New Mexico?
That's
Sarah
Taos.
Or you're in,
Reno,
okay, good. You're in Lake Tahoe?
like, yes.
Okay. Don't confuse me. Yeah, I remember skiing in Lake Tahoe too. But on the other side of Nevada, in the California side. Beautiful when you're skiing down and you see the lake down there. Fantastic. Many years back. Who's from Sacramento here? Somebody from Sacramento? No?
That's the Heavenly Valley side. That's when you see the lake.
Yeah.
The other side is
Beautiful.
Squaw. It's beautiful.
Remember Larry Bertolucci?
I do.
Larry Bertolucci was from Sacramento.
Sacramento.
And he used to have a house there in the mountains for skiing. So I used to take my kids when they were 5, 7 years of age. Now he's 42.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Then we do a little bit of distraction here. I thought it was his neck. I warded him out there. Now, we take the occiput, we palpate the spinous process of C2, we go around C2, we hold C2 on the opposite side, and we start doing some a little bit more specific occiput to C2 distraction. Only 15 degrees of cranial rotation. You don't need to do more than that because you don't want to invert the lower cervical spine. Then you may do a little long axis distraction. You hold C2 gently. You don't need to stabilize it. And start doing your dorsal glides. Just to stabilize the anterior arch of atlas to the dents and lubricating the space between occiput and atlas. And you may do a little bit of pumping, anterior rotation of occiput. So you ski on blacks. You do jumps, moguls, all that stuff. You do it with the wide skis or the narrow skis. But that's a little bit more difficult to do, isn't it? Or you have to put a lot of more pressure on your tails. But I still think that the Rocky Mountains are the best. So you have to talk to the patient because otherwise he's just waiting what he's going to do next. What's what you're going to do next? So you have to relax him. So I'm just lubricating and opening up the space between occiput and C2. So when I feel that I have enough flexible space and I feel that the dorsal glide is becoming a lot less resistant to my pressures, I distract. Now my axis is here. So the axis is going to be here. I'm going to put my hands around, and I need to do the same amount of movement that I'm doing on the right, on the left. So you can see that when I do that, on the right side, my right hand is actually distracting, while the left hand is going to be mobilizing. So just following the circular movement, you can see that my index fingers on the left side are actually gliding medially. And that is pushing the spinous process to the right, allowing the body of C2 to rotate towards the left. But I'm side bending the head towards the left in a pure axis of movement. So I look at the axis, I go around the method process, under the occiput, and immediately my fingers will fall lateral to the spinous process of C2. distract. I side bend him to the left, and I'm pushing the spinous process to the right. That's as far as he gets in side bending and rotation of C2 or C3. I distract. Now I get to the right side, and I have a lot more simple movement of side glide to the right. But it's a pure rotation here. So it's easier for me to do this. This is easy. So I have to concentrate on the left side. And I'm pushing the spinous process towards the right. So I'm actually mobilizing more C2 or C3 than actually occiput on atlas. I'm just using the occiput to push on the alar ligament and facilitate the rotation of C2 or C3. Okay, she's becoming a little bit more human after 2 or 3 mobilizations. He's starting to have his perhaps movement restored. Every movement is going to be a second. I distract and I compare with the right side. And when I start feeling that these movements are becoming very nicely proportional, and you feel how easier it's getting for you to move towards the left side?
Yeah.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, now rotate actively anterior a little bit, just a little bit, just 15 degrees. Very small movement. Okay. Very good. Now, if he was my case, could I have one of the towels? I forgot to bring my floaty. Are you okay?
Yeah, good.
You want to go to sleep?
Yeah.
Now I'll have a cervical roll of about 3 inches tall, but very foamy. And we will have this on his cervical spine. A little cervical roll. Is that okay? Feel good? So now you have to remember that occiput has been like this. I'm exaggerating, but maybe like that. So the space between occiput and C2 is decreased, which means that the posterior rectus capitis, posterior minor and major are shortened. But the anterior rectus capitis, anterior minor and major are elongated in a state of inefficiency because they're just sitting on the bones in the back. So we have to open up the space between occiput and atlas to stress the rectus capitis, posterior minor and major, and start activating the rectus capitis, anterior minor to be able to hold occiput in a new craniovertebral angulation. So you have to activate the upper cervical spine flexors. Upper cervical spine flexors, not lower cervical spine flexors. That's why you keep them in lordosis. So I'm going to tell him, and you can get an idea. I can hold his head, and I can say, okay, now just gently do a full flexion. And he's not doing it. I'm basically doing it. And that's the full flexion of his head and neck. So you can divide this distance in 3/3. All right? So basically, on the first third of craniocervical flexion, he's only working from occiput down to C3 in 1/3 head and neck flexion. So most of your headache patients only work on 1/3 head and neck flexion. So I will start